the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of the Torvus Podcast. My name is Ari, and I'm joined by Jason and Alex, and we are doing a special tribute show to our friend Dane. And this is going to be about sword and sorcery. Now, Dane was a massive fan of fantasy, sword and sorcery, geek culture. The whole podcast actually was started because of him in a very weird way, but he was a good friend of mine, passed away a few years ago, and today we've decided that this whole episode is going to be about him. It is August the 7th, and so it's actually, it would have been Dane's 40th birthday today. So this whole thing for Dane Botfield, the master Viking, master blacksmith, and geek extraordinaire. So welcome to the Sword and Sorcery podcast of the Torvus Podcast, and we're going to get into it. This is a weird one because we're going to be talking about a genre, and Alex and I and Jason were talking about what is sword and sorcery? What is the genre of sword and sorcery? There are many, many books and films about it, and we're going to actually focus mainly on the films, and mainly the films that are from the 1980s. Some of them you've heard of, and some of them you have not. We're going to talk about ones that are worthy of seeing and ones that you should avoid at all costs because they're utter shit. Yeah. So let's just kind of get into what sword and sorcery is. Now, it is typically, the phrase was coined in 1961 by Fritz Leiber, who is an author, and he had done many books. It was the Lankmar mythos, Grey Mouser, Fafnir and Grey Mouser. It's great books. Amazing. So highly suggest that you listen to it. They almost like, there's like the godfather of these genres, and he is considered one of them, or the grandfather of the genre. So he was writing a letter to another author by the name of Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock,
another giant.
What did he write? So he invented the Elric series, Melbourne mythos. Fantastic. So they were going back and forward amongst themselves. There's some discussion they were also speaking about Robert E. Howard, who is the author of Conan, which is a quintessential sword and sorcery movie from the 1980s. So
probably the most famous. Most people think of
most mainstream for sure. I think that really broke into popular culture.
Yeah, and so the thing about the whole sword and sorcery, also referred to sword and sandals sometimes, without if you're taking out the sorcery and magic component to it, but
your gladiator kind of level stuff.
But there is
more modern, or I guess that's not even modern anymore.
Yeah, but there is a very particular thing that it must follow. So Alex was talking about kind of these 10 steps that a sword and sorcery has. And there's certain things that have to be in play for it to be considered a sword and sorcery type of film. Now, there's something called high fantasy and things like that. So we're kind of he's going to read off just a little list of the top 10 things that make a sword and sorcery. So Alex, take it away.
Yeah, so this is kind of inspired by Joseph Campbell, and when he wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces. and really sort of analyze the storytelling and the mythology behind these types of tales. Essentially, there's 10 basic steps that you can break it down into. Number one is sort of the ordinary world. This introduces the setting. And often, as Ari and I were noting before, there's a big monologue with the guy with the most impressive, manly, deep voice out there. I don't know who they get to do the voices, but it's just spectacular. In almost all of them, even if the movie's terrible, the monologue at the beginning is pretty impressive.
I drink to Atlantis.
Yeah. And so after they've established the ordinary world and set the scene, the next step is the call to adventure. And this is where...
With a C, not a K.
Yes. This is where the hero gets from the transformation from the ordinary world into the special world. So this is where we're starting to get our intro into what the mythology or the supernatural aspect is going to be. Step 3 is crossing the first threshold. This is when now you're officially in it. We're no longer in Kansas anymore. There's something strange happening. Step 4, trials, friends, and foes. Among the hero's journey, the main character encounters many obstacles. Some people may try to stop you along your quest, potentially saying you're unreasonable or unrealistic. And this is sort of where the hero comes across people who could be friends or foes. There's interactions. It's sort of a one-on-one conversation with different characters.
You know what? Since you said that, I think I'm trapped in a Sword and Sorcery novel because I've had that happen lots.
Yeah. And then step 5 is the magical mentor or the mentor with supernatural aid. So after you've met a few people, you always get introduced to this sort of higher power or this magic sword, this sort of blessing of the gods, if you will, something like that, where the character is now given a sense of divine power or supernatural intervention in a positive way to help them be able to deal with the antagonist. The next step is the dragon's lair. This is the significant threshold where the hero is now leveled up. He's got his bearings in this new strange world, and he's at his, he has to sort of enter and begin the main part of the resolution of the conflict. Step 7 is the moment of despair. This is, along the adventure, that this is when you think inevitably it ends up with some form of nail biter. You have to make the reader intrigued, and you have, thinking that somebody's going to die or the princess isn't going to survive or whatever the scenario is, the end of the world is going to happen. This is that moment. And then after that is the ultimate treasure. So this is once the hero has sort of resolved that conflict and has now moved on into getting his prize. Step 9 is the homeward bound. So essentially, in a lot of the novels, you see this less and less in the films, but more specifically in the novels or the original myths, is the return journey, which I think is really important, especially I grew up reading a lot of Greek mythology, and the journey home, like, for example, the Odyssey, one of the most famous books of myth of all time, is essentially a journey home after the Battle of Troy. And then step 10 is the rebirth and the champion's return. So this is how the character went from that mundane existence, and sort of a synopsis of how the whole story has changed him and reshaped him into how he's going to reintegrate back into that normal society, even though he's either interacted with or become supernatural himself. So that's sort of just the main overlay of how the majority of these stories essentially formulaically follow that.
Also identified some very specific things that we noticed in many of these films in the 1980s that would always occur that happened. So Alex had already touched upon this, that he was talking about the monologue at the beginning of the film. And again, deep voice talking about where the state of the affairs are in politics in the world and things like that. And probably the most famous, I think, is the Conan, the Subutai talking about he's a chronicler. And, Conan sat with a troubled brow, and fantastic stuff. But that seems to be a recurring thing. And we had briefly turned on the Netflix, and we were watching Ator, the fighting eagle, for probably about 5 minutes. So we skimmed through. It's an hour and 30 minutes long. We watched the film in about 5 minutes. It was absolutely horrible and amazing. But that film starts with a monologue. The great thing about that, I'm going to segue, is it's actually Italian. So the lead is English and everyone else is Italian in it. So when the
spaghetti's not just for Westerns.
spaghetti, sword and sorcery. So you can see that they're dubbing everyone else's voices, but the American's voice isn't, but the timing is off. It was so horrible.
Yeah.
And it was talking about the spider
King.
Yeah.
And he's
a real spider.
Yeah, he was just playing with his tarantulas. Like, you got to give credit here where they attempt to create special effects or magic using very mundane, common, like low budget.
Low budget is one of the characteristics.
And sometimes they pull it off. Like sometimes there's a unique weapon, which we'll get into later, or little cantrips that the wizards will do that are actually pretty clever. Like, I definitely think we got to give a little bit of credit, even though
it's what you
80%
can do
of the
with
time,
your low budget.
it's garbage.
Can you use your low budget well?
Yeah.
So we will come to Ator and we will talk about it. So the monologue is one. The next thing that we always see in these films is prophecy. That the witch is talking to the king, saying that there's going to be an unborn child, which is another thing that in these sword and sorceries that will come, that will be born, and then they will dethrone the king. And it's in all of these. And again, some are really good and some are horrible.
But some are horrible, and it's a good way of being horrible, and it's a bad way of being horrible. You can be bad, but if you go bad enough, then you can be cool again.
And that's what we're going to talk about later, because Jason and I have been kind of debating on what makes bad and what makes bad good. And
some genres can do this. You can go so bad. Same martial arts movies, the same thing. You can get super bad and cheesy, and then it's entertaining again. You can't be mediocre bad. You got to be good, or you got to be really bad. If you're just bad, then forget it.
Yeah, you can almost achieve like a satirical, sarcastic way of telling the story through that stereotypical exaggerated effect. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these movies, I think, achieve that, even though I think on some level there was some part of a director that was trying to come up with a serious film.
Some is intentional, some is
unintentional. Yeah. So, I can't defend the entire thing as a whole, because I think, I think a lot of people have attempted it and messed it up more than the people who've attempted it and nailed it. And that's my opinion.
And so we're talking about other things in there, obviously. So the hero's journey, it's typically, especially in the 80s, it was like the male adventure. There was Red Sonja, but it was pretty rare to have a female lead during the Sword and Sorcery. I mean, it's evolved since then, thank goodness. But at the time, the male, the bare-chested, kind of that bodybuilder in good shape.
A lot of bodybuilders got some jobs.
Yes.
Like if you're looking for a thing to do as a bodybuilder in the 80s and you needed some work,
Sword and Sorcery.
Doors open for you. Like, what are you going to do with those abs and chest?
And you didn't have to act.
And that's what I want to think that Arnold Schwarzenegger really helped change that game, is that by having a really limited vocabulary and not speaking English to the full extent that he eventually learned how to do, it really sort of cast the role a bit differently and restricted the amount of lines, and also that more brutish barbarian where he just would pick a girl up instead of having a conversation, right? Things that would have now been deemed unacceptable were in that setting a potentially more stylized way for that character to interact with the world around him, right? Whether I'm not talking about whether the specifics of that act, I'm just saying that character acts in that way because he's limited by not having any sort of communication skills. Mm-hmm. It's I pick it up and I smash it. That's kind of how they deal with these things, and they come up with a character that is very two-dimensional, but because of the prophecy and the backstory and the intricacy of the fantasy, it allows this sort of more dull, mundane character to take on something more extraordinary.
Yeah, but again, it's what you do with it. It's like there's B special effects, but there's also B acting.
Yes.
And it's what you can do with B acting. Arnold Schwarzenegger is a B actor. Yeah. He's an awesome guy to watch. I watch all his movies.
Yeah.
But he's not a great actor, but he's a great B actor.
He's not a ton of range.
He's a great actor to watch, but he's not like a British guy that's got like this huge range that can do all this stuff. It's like, no, but he still can be good to watch. So if you can be a B, but you can still really do a lot of stuff with it, then that's the thing. Same as special effects. Like when we were talking about Star Trek before. Same thing. You don't have to be the best actor in the world to make a really great movie.
But I think he also set the precedent on that brute and that that sort of more dull, less intelligent style of character, or not necessarily less intelligent, but just less vocal, because he had the actual language barrier. So they had to work with him and come up with this character and create these scenes where he solved the problem using his size.
But one of those things, because people don't realize, actually Arnold's English was very good in 1982 when Conan came out, but it was the producers in Hollywood that had an issue with him because of his accent.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, he didn't sound...
Yeah, like, so there's a film in the 1970s, it's like Hercules Unbound, I think it's called, where they cast him in it, but they gave him an American accent. They dubbed over some American's voice on because it wasn't Hollywood, and it's really, really bad. And once Arnold was given full reign to actually speak, the public just ate it up. They loved it. They loved it.
It's great. It
I'll
totally
be
works
back,
with,
right? But like that's how that whole started, and he had to sort of really break ground because of that language barrier. Not that he didn't have a full understanding of the language, simply just that he was a foreigner speaking with a different accent, right? And that
but as a barbarian outsider, the accent works. So that's what I'm saying, is you make it
because it sounds
there, instead of having somebody who's a Queen's own English isn't going to be as good. So the worse his English is, the better it is for the character.
And the characters weren't educated, right? A lot of these characters, like Conan, for example, he pushed a wheel around to grow up. Like, you know what I mean? He didn't go to school. He was, you know, but like that's
scrolls of poetry.
That's sort of the whole fun part about it, is you can take this really sort of fantastic setting and apply sort of a more mundane character, and that setting will grow the character. You're creating this person through the story, which is allows for sort of different level of storytelling.
So we have identified the monologue as being one that's quintessential. The prophecy, the male child typically being born. So Jay, I'm going to throw it to you. What's another thing that we consistently see in these sword and sorcery films that the hero or the genre has, that it crosses all the films? What's another one that comes to mind?
Special weapons. We touched on this when we did our weapons episode. Watch previous episode, insert thing wherever.
Click the link
right here.
Wherever people do that kind of thing. But no, like, there's cool weapons in these things. Again, one I brought up, I believe it had to be me. Who else is that smart? The Sword and the Sorcerer, very quintessential, talking about sword and sorcery movies with the triple sword. Totally awesome. You've got like double crossbow and different things. You got just different cool weapons. Cool weapons are a big part of it. And getting in here, blacksmiths are another one of those things that really get into here, especially for this episode. Yeah. But look at Conan's dad, blacksmith, right? Dragon Slayer, blacksmith. You know.
Yeah, all these things right. All these films had that kind of like either making of the weapon, making of the sword, or finding the epic special weapon, as in Conan when he found the Atlantean sword, right? So
and often they will give a backstory, like whether it was created by the gods or how the weapon was forged. Even if you don't get to meet or interact with those characters and have the weapon forged, still the forging process is quite a mystical and empowering way to imbue this magic or supernatural ability into a weapon that the hero then, once he does his life trying his hardest, barely gets by as a regular person, once he gets that, then he can excel. It's like a big jump in power, a big level up.
So just like thing after thing, you can go into Conan's got the Atlantean sword there, his father's sword also,
which breaks
in there, but that's deeper levels of things. You can go into the mind sword from Hawk the Slayer. You can go, like, it's just so many things that you can even go into non-sword and sorcery stuff, and you can go into like Lord of the Rings. You get like the weapon idea of forging and reforging and all that stuff. The Dragon Slayer spear. You know, like
we also have to talk about the ridiculousness behind some of these weapons, because the sword and sorcery genre is very much that like 70s van scene where like an angel
airbrush a van in the 70s,
and wearing the most
metal,
like,
right? We're talking about that earlier.
Heavy metal. Little steel bikini and a massive sword that would, there's no way proportionally to that person they would be able to lift
and yet
that
it's
weapon.
Still better than modern D&D art. Fuck those artists. Bullshit, overpowered swords. Damn you, Warhammer, too. But anyway.
And there are some fantastically horrible special weapons that they make for these movies. Like, and Alex is totally right. One of the other things that they do in these movies is typically the hero has it's not a sword and sorcery if you don't have the sword
on your
slung
back.
on your back. And you're able to pull it out. And then the great thing about it, which I love in all these films, is they go like this. They take the sword and then they go whoosh, like one shot. Like, how easy is that? I implore you, if you have a sheath and you sling it, I try to do that, and it's kind of like left, right? So very difficult, very fun.
Well, and you know why a lot of the times they have to hang it off their back though? It's because the weapon is too large to be off their hip, right? Because you're now effectively doubling the distance between the weapon and the ground, right? You've raised it up.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times when they have these massive swords and things too, like how else would you possibly carry that, right? It's it allows for some really weird costumes as well, because like you're saying, they want to draw attention to these just shredded guys wearing loincloths taking on the dragon or whatever, right?
So I'm gonna segue into here a Dane story. Now, this story, Dane and I were talking about this several years ago. We were talking about fantasy films and sword films, and so Dane was a blacksmith. And I'm going to get into a very special thing that's being sent by his wife, Belinda. She's sending me his very first axe that he made, and it's going to go right up there, and I can't wait. So thank you, Belinda. I really appreciate it.
So
it's going to be
awesome.
amazing. It's a throwing axe, and I got a video from her, and it was amazing. So that's going to go up there. It's got tons of scars on it. The handle's cracked, but it's perfect.
Character. You need to have character to
Yeah.
special weapons. That's so awesome and so appropriate.
So the story that Dane and I chatted about years ago was about the hero, and they would typically have their sword. And in all of these films, or many of them, it's the hero for some reason would take their sheath and they'd wrap it in fur. And then they'd have string around it, and that would kind of be their thing. And they'd put it in their pack, right on their horses. And so I remember Dane's like, all right, you remember like all these things, it's like furry covered sheaths that all these swords go into that the hero puts on the back of the horse. I'm like, yeah, like it was a thing to I guess the hero couldn't always have it slung on their back.
Yeah.
So they needed to, let's just put it away. But for some reason we were talking about why they were always fur covered. It's right, because they are, right? They're just like,
it's like the UGG of like sword sheaths. Like why? Like it's like, oh, okay, cool.
Because it's cold steel.
I think it kind of players off the whole barbarian thing too. Like we were
Yes.
looking at the Ator or whatever that one was, that he was wearing like a yak loincloth or something. Like oh man, it was just like the worst carpet, the shag carpet you've seen. Like that was what he was wearing
So
around his
bad.
waist. Like
And he did have Uggs on.
yeah. Yeah, like and the boots with the big furry thing too. Like
my
oh
God.
yeah, you got to keep warm because like you know you better protect that 1 inch of your ankle because the rest of your body's totally exposed.
It's
So,
totally,
like,
yeah. Oh my God, so crazy. So sword in the back, male child, prophecy, monologue, special weapons. What other things typically? Oh, you know what they usually have? They usually have on the hero or someone in the film has a mark, either a tattoo, a scar, a branding, and that makes the hero different from everything else. So Beastmaster,
Yeah, with them.
he's got the little brand on his palm, and he was like the first.
And you get that
one.
chosen son
the
of
prophecy, like able for
Oh,
people to
okay,
identify as the prophecy, right? Yeah.
So here's the crazy thing about Sword and Sorcery. All these films, and literally there are hundreds, if not thousands of them. And I'm ashamed to say that I've seen most of them. And the story is the same, but the variation of how they're filmed, what the story they're actually telling, they vary. And so some are great and some are horrendous. And that's a lot when you have three geeks sitting around and we can all agree that some movies really suck.
Yeah.
That means the threshold is really low. Like our threshold
I'm
for
pretty
like,
forgiving.
exactly, right?
The genre I love, yeah.
And ask any geek, the forgiveness on film is pretty, it's pretty high in some ways, but we're also very particular about some other things that we just can't let slip.
Yeah.
I mean, we are nitpicking about, you know, oh man, the orc had wrong armor and he was the wrong color and like his helmet was wrong. Like it's weird. But
We're also pretty particular about the martial arts and the fight scenes,
yes,
which
Don't get me started on magnetic swords.
is
Oh.
incredibly painful. On like I can't even think of one of these movies where I was like, yeah, that was a good fight scene.
Never.
Like, that was cool. Like, no, they're always just awful.
So, Alex,
Oh.
you're talking about the horrendous fight scenes, but Jason is talking about something called magnetic swords. How about you discuss what exactly magnetic swords
I
are?
call them magnetic swords, and this is not just sword and sorcery, stage fighting. Lots of people that watch modern movies are used to great fight choreography and stuff, and there's been some awesome stuff done in the recent thing. But magnetic swords are when you swing your sword, you swing it at the other person's sword. You're not trying to kill the other person.
Yeah.
You're trying to hit their sword. And they're trying to hit their sword. And you're doing it with one hand with things you shouldn't
Like
be
4-year-olds
swinging.
playing with sticks.
Yeah,
like, same
it's
thing.
like it's like with the Christmas paper
Yeah.
wrapping thing, and you're
Yeah.
sitting there trying to hit the sword. So that's
Yeah.
what the magnetic swords. The swords will always go to the swords, or sword versus axe, or whatever it is. The weapons magnetize to each other. You're not trying to hit the person; you're just trying to hit the weapon, and that's how you can see some of the bad fighting. But if you want to enjoy these cheesy genres, you have to embrace and say, okay, are they going to do it? Are they really going to lean into that?
Yeah.
And do it in a good way?
I don't know. I mean, maybe they didn't have a fight choreographer on it. You know,
The choreographer.
I think it just becomes part of it at some point, but like in some of them, it's like very, very bad. So
Yeah.
I would say that it's similar to, for example, a lot of the scenes in The Princess Bride, not the fencing scenes because those are incredible, but a lot of the other combat scenes are, I'd say, like subpar for a movie of that caliber, even though that's a weird one to talk about. But still, the way that the hand-to-hand combat is and the way that Andre the Giant was fighting and stuff in that is, it leaves something to be inspired. It's not fantastic. And, you know, I think that...
But it was a comedy, Alex. You can't, like, The Princess Bride is really unique in that way.
But the fencing and everything
that
was
stands out.
so
It's the exception
cool.
that proves the rule.
Like, and that's what I mean. So they get away with it. And that's where I was, because I was thinking that, Jason, I don't know if this is a forgivable, like, you know, it is very distracting when the guy tries to stick a knife through and you can see it like going under his arm.
Oh,
like,
yeah, when the sword
yeah,
goes-
it's like, oh
and people are
man,
getting
like,
cut. You're always doing the stomach cut where
on.
they hit them like a club in the stomach and then they pull it across and there's no blood and cuts. Like special effects.
So I'm going to actually, because we were just watching, because Ator, we keep talking about this film, this Italian film. So
don't watch it.
But it's so good. So he's taking the sword and he's thrusting it, right? So they have the camera angle, but obviously it's just going rah, like that, and the camera's on the other side, right? So it looks like it's
from
going
the other side.
But yeah,
watch this special effect now.
So this is Ator, right? And then he
Wow.
dies, right? Like as you can see, it's clearly in me, right? So and they did that like I don't know a dozen times.
And it would be the same kind of bullshit where it wouldn't even be red on the way out.
It was
so you know that kind of thing. So yeah, you get to the point where it's bad, and then it kind of gets to be a parody of itself.
Yeah.
Maybe I should get some of the TV ones later about parody.
Oh, so good. Yeah. So,
but I think that a quintessential thing that makes a good sword and sorcery, it does not even, you can't rate the quality of the fight scenes.
Yeah.
Like they're just as a pretty like good stand. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger, who like it has some incredible
way
fight scenes
better
in his
job
resume.
than-
Like
yeah,
and he does a good job.
Actual athletic ability.
Even still, like Conan, it's not there.
And it's going to be worse for you because you grew up seeing good fight scenes.
Yes.
But for us, we were like, remember when
You look
Obi-Wan
at
versus
the
Darth
first
Vader
Star
was like
Wars,
a good sword fight?
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
but if you're younger and you grew up with like Duel of the Fates with like like I mean, you say what you want about the Star Wars prequels, but the lightsaber battles are way better. I know we're supposed to be talking about Sword and Sorcery, but I'm just saying era-wise, if that's what you grew up with, the old one's got to look pretty bad.
Yeah.
But if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, it was like, yeah, that was as good as it got, you know, and same thing.
And obviously, like for us, we've seen where the martial arts were and that the technology and the people were, like the information was available to these people to put in good fight scenes. They didn't even consider it to be an important part. Right. So like, you know, Steven Seagal, like he was around at that time, like the fight scenes could be so much better. And I think that would add another level to the film. But you know, again, you can't even quantify it or start to look at it because you're just going to get disappointed.
So they're B movies. You got to see it in a B movie frame.
Yeah.
It's like when we did horror movies and stuff, right? Remember we did Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah.
you can't go and say, okay, is this best modern special effects? You gotta go,
But
oh my
horror,
God,
there
so
are
cheesy.
some good ones though. Like
Yeah.
horror, there can be terrifying movies that don't even have to have a good CGI monster or something.
Right,
in
and
the
some
background,
things
right?
hold
Like,
up. Like
yeah.
The Thing, it's still scary.
Yeah.
Right, even though it's dated,
But
it holds up.
But this is where, so this is bad and good bad, right? So there is a line that we're talking about here. What falls on one side and what falls to the other. So we're going to start getting into some of the films from the 1980s that we've watched that are quintessential in this genre. So the first one we've already talked about was Conan. Now, Jason is a Conan fan.
I'm a big Conan fan. But we're just going to talk about the film, because if we get into the comics and the books
it's a whole nother
and all
episode.
that, that's another thing. So if you want to be a Howard purist, then you're going to be like anti the movies. Oh my God, they're butchery. They're not the true Conan. But it's just a parallel universe, and film's different than, anyway. I enjoy them all.
So, but as a Conan fan and a Howard fan and of the writings of it, you still, and me as well, we really thoroughly enjoyed Conan.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, for me personally, Conan is the pinnacle of Sword and Sorcery. Mm-hmm. And although there's some great ones out there too, I think that is the standard for me.
Yeah, if you're like, you can only watch one kind of thing. If you're not a Sword and Sorcery person, that's, if you had to say, there's your Desert Island kind of Sword and Sorcery one.
It was in such an incredibly popular like concept that it branched out, and a lot of like nerdy video games or role-playing games include some version of a Conan in it. So for example, like the Fallout games that Bethesda released have Grognak the Barbarian, an entire like comic line within this story, like just hidden there for the hardcore fans, that is exactly Conan. Like he became the barbarian. That whole jacked, like, kind of inspired the whole new 300 where all the Spartans, they actually fight in their underwear just so you can see their jacked abs. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. It's like, it's so ridiculous, but like it inspired that type of culture. No one fights battles like that. Like they invented armor, like, you know what I mean? That's very gladiator showmanship.
And they took off armor as like male muscle body exploitation. Thing was just like boom, doors were blown open.
Yeah, and it was this like sexy, this is strong, these big dudes, right? And
which changed the idea of masculinity. If you look at some of the pictures of Conan from before,
totally, yeah.
Like I said, that's more back into the.
Yeah, there's a lot of toxic stuff in these films. It's definitely made in a different time, but
So Jason, since Conan is one of your favorites, let's kind of go deeper into the film itself. So, obviously, it is not the same as the novels. I understand that, but when you first watched the film,
it's awesome. It's awesome.
What are your takeaways from it? Like, what sits with you going, this is really awesome and this is really awesome? Like, what's the first thing?
There's so many things. The riddle of steel, like right from the beginning, he's got his blacksmith father in there. He's got the thing, forging the sword. Mother's wrapping the thing. It's the whole family is coming together to make this sword. His dad takes him up on the mountain. There's explaining about the gods and the riddle of steel. That's the thing for the movie of Conan, and that really makes things all go together. One of my favorite video games I mentioned before, Dominions, and I often play Ulm, which has their whole thing is built around the riddle of steel.
Okay.
But that was the whole thing, is to get that riddle of steel. What is that? And then also Doom and bringing that together with the flesh and all that. It's just like so much there. And throughout all of the different Sword and Sorceries, you can look at that as a good theme for any of them. It's like, how does this guy? You were doing a hero's journey. I would say you could approach it as the riddle of steel journey. It's like, how does this hero approach his riddle of steel? How does he solve that riddle of their own?
Yeah, we're like, how does that character fit into the prophecy, right? Because a lot of the times too, like at that moment of despair, there's a question. There's always, am I the chosen one? Am I not the chosen one? And again, we can branch out to things like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, which are like a Sword and Sorcery gone really, really, really well. like, you know what I mean? Like they have at its essence.
But again, if you're gonna do that, you're gonna do Star Wars. You're gonna do the riddle of the lightsaber.
Totally.
Right. So that's the steel. You're gonna do the Mandalorian. Right. What are you gonna do? You're gonna deal with the steel there, the forging it. Again, it brings it all
And that's why I think that when we talk about a movie and how it can lack these certain elements, it still has a story and a level of creativity that's really fun, and the character that can be, that barbarian that pushed a big wheel around. That was this.
But you're forging
Conan,
the character,
right?
so it's very D&D character creation. Not just forging the weapon.
Nope.
The character is the weapon. And it's the weapon behind the weapon. You're forging on that wheel there. I created you, and then you want to get into the "I'm your father" thing. Combining that back again with the same voice guy, but anyway, too many tangents. I gotta stay on this show. But yeah, you're forging him on the wheel there. The training, all of these sword and sorcery heroes, they're being forged. They're their own riddle that they're trying to solve themselves.
So Robert E. Howard has one of my favorite quotes of all time. I think it's very apropos for the life we're living in now. But this is the quote, and it is, civilized men are more discourteous than savages because they know that they can be impolite with having their skulls split as a general thing.
So true.
It's very true, right? People get away with saying stuff because they know that there's no...
More true than I can express.
There's no consequences to some actions. And so great quote from that. The other thing is...
There's a whole essay on that.
The Wheel of Pain, which Conan is pushing around, they actually incorporated that into the World's Strongest Man competition.
Yeah.
Really?
You didn't know that, Alex?
No, I hadn't heard that, and it's actually called the Wheel of Pain.
Yeah, and it's made, and it's this big thing that
there's a great little documentary thing you can watch.
Fantastic!
Yeah,
you gotta look it up on YouTube because it's great. So they've incorporated that into the World's Strongest Man. So great thing. So love it.
So many things, and you got to suffer and go through those things. Tree of woe, like just so many things. But
we should actually point out, it's like in the beginning of the film when Conan is wandering through the desert, he's being chased by the dogs. He finds this outcropping, and he ends up falling into a tomb, I guess, of some lost king, and that's where he finds the Atlantean sword. Which is very cool, and remember it has all the rust on it and stuff, and the rock, and he's shattering it. And
a good quality sword. You can just give it a couple whacks, and it cleans itself. It's awesome.
Yeah, so I really like that, and it does have all these nods to D&D. That's exactly what it is. It's just like, entering a dungeon.
No.
You know,
it's the other way around. D&D has nods to it. Conan's before D&D.
But I'm talking about this particular the film itself, though.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so in Robert E. Howard, though, in the actual novels, because I haven't read the Conan stuff, is that particular scene in the Robert E. Howard stuff?
The movie is like a jumble of a whole bunch of different things. There's so much.
Okay.
There's so much more in there. But my point was that D&D is based. Sword and Sorcery is one of the bases. So,
totally. Yes.
Yeah. Gary Gygax really loved Robert E. Howard.
Yes. And as you're saying, Falcon and Grey Mouth and a whole bunch. But you got to remember now, Robert E. Howard was writing for the pulps. The pulp fiction stuff was in like the 30s.
30s, right? Yeah.
So that's where things go. I mean, you can go even further back in some ways with Barsoom stuff and the teens and stuff. But still, it's a really earlier thing, and it's earlier than Lord of the Rings, even though Lord of the Rings gets more credit. Right. I'm more of a Sword and Sorcery guy.
So I stand corrected. But it does give you that kind of like, it's a very common theme in Dungeons and Dragons, finding the weapon. Lost Tomb has been there for 100 years now, and so it's very cool. And I think all kids they fantasize about that.
Well, and again, that it goes to why it works and why Dungeons and Dragons can be so fantastic is because it allows you to establish this character, this person, with a brief synopsis of a couple key details, and then you get to assume that person and play the role.
Yeah.
Just like when you're watching this character, you see them as this base mundane, okay, summarize it, I get this person, and then watch them go through the journey. And that allows for a little bit of extra connection because they've really made the character easy to understand and accept at the level, at the base level, right?
Yeah. Developing your character, again, your hero's journey, your character creation, get that backstory in there.
Yeah, exactly. And they go hand in hand in that the way that the films, inspired people and that level of creativity, and you're wondering, oh, could that be me? Or, oh, I'm stuck in this average mundane world. Like The Matrix was one for me as a kid where it was like, you know, oh, could I be the one? That kind of thing, right? Like you can put yourself in the hero's shoes and sort of go through that journey on a more personal level. And again, they don't have to be complicated stories. They follow a fairly generic thing. Like when you play D&D, you're doing the same types of things with different flavors, but it's still the same experience. And that can just be enjoyable to a lot of people because the level of creativity and just freedom of expression that you get to have.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to talk about some trivia from Conan because Torvus Podcast, we like to do trivia. So here's some trivia from Conan, the 1982 film. So James Earl Jones was a last-minute addition to the film, and it was because of his commitments on Broadway at the time. Now, he and Arnold became friends on the set, and Schwarzenegger helped Jones stay in shape, while Jones helped Schwarzenegger with his acting. So that was one little piece of trivia. Also, Arnold Schwarzenegger does call this God's gift to his career. It did catapult him.
It totally made it.
Wow.
This is a really neat piece of trivia from the Conan film. Arnold Schwarzenegger had weapons training, martial arts training, and horse riding lessons from specialists. He trained with an 11-pound broadsword 2 hours a day for 3 months.
Wow.
And he learned how to handle each one.
Which is way heavier than the real.
Super, yeah. Each broadsword was $10,000, and they had to look weathered. So he also learned climbing techniques and how to fall and jump. Because he did all the stunts in the film because no suitable body double or stuntman could
Where are
be
you getting a
found.
body double for this universe?
Right.
Like, come on.
He can't. So quite interesting. And so apparently for Franco Columbo, which was a friend of Arnold Schwarzenegger, it was his trainer at the time. He was rewarded a small part in the film because Arnold's like, hey, Franco, come in. So he did. And apparently Arnold Schwarzenegger has a snake dagger from the film as a memento.
Oh, the double,
Really?
the double
Yeah,
snake.
he kept it.
Wow.
Yeah, so it got some cool
Really?
things in there. Yeah, for sure. So just some trivia from the Conan film. Now, just when you thought Conan was awesome, it got really bad when they made Conan the Destroyer. Although not as bad as some of the other B and C and D movies that are out there, Conan
It's a step down.
It is a step down, and I think it was a disappointment just because the story kind of sucked, and I don't know, it could have been gone in a lot of better directions, but wasn't a fan of Conan the Destroyer.
It wasn't as good.
Say what?
It wasn't as good. No.
No.
I don't think anybody would say it was as good or better.
Yeah, and a lot of people haven't seen it, so it's what wasn't great, and we are
It's
also
got some cool parts to it too.
but we're waiting for Conan the Conqueror. Or Conan.
King Conan.
King
It's like this is the biggest point. Like, Arnold, what the fuck are you doing? You were the governor. You've already been king in the real world. Now you come back. Don't die before you make this movie. This is if there's one movie you have to make before the end. This is a movie you have to make. You have to go full circle and do this.
Yeah, you did Terminator already.
You still can. Like, really. This is a movie that needs to be made. They've been talking about it for years and years. It's like, oh, here, no, oh, we're gonna do it, not gonna do it. Like, do it.
Yeah, he certainly has to.
Like that. He's a perfect guy to do it. And again, because he's been a king already, in the real world, it's a perfect thing to do it. He's the old guy in there. There's more depth. He's grown over
The real
years.
question though is Conan going to be a vegan or not?
Because he is?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's always something that really kind of shocked and surprised me. And I think, doesn't he also has ponies that live in his house?
Yeah, but he's
Okay.
actually not a vegan.
But-
He's not a vegan, by the way.
Okay.
In Sword and Sorcery, when I talk about little tropes and things, you have to have the not side of beef, but the limb with the thing there,
Yes.
which can be used as
Yes.
a weapon or just eaten or stuff. They've got to be the big whole
The club and the
whole
meal.
limb of meat
Yes.
kind of thing there. You've got to have that. That's in. You can't make a good Sword and Sorcery movie without having that in there somewhere.
So hopefully he does make King Conan, because that would be awesome.
Like, as if he's listening to me, but
Yeah.
dude,
Yeah.
I'll send him this.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to start heading down the path of some awesome, in my opinion, B-movie Sword and Sorcery films. So, Jason, do you want to kick it off with a Sword and Sorcery film that you thought was pretty good?
Beastmaster is really good. really good one. Holds up well over the years. A lot of movies don't hold up when you watch them again, but Beastmaster, I think, holds up. It's got a lot of different layers to it. It's got a pretty, and far within the sword and sorcery B genre thing. It's got a good story. Acting's not completely horrible, you know. It's got some cool characters. It's got a lot going for it.
So Beastmaster was filmed in 1982. It had a budget of...
Is it 82 also?
Yeah, had a budget of $9 million.
Which is huge.
Wow.
It made $14.1 million at the box office.
Man.
It was had Mark Singer in it as
the main guy?
As the main
I
guy.
don't know actors.
There was some really cool things. So what I remember of Beastmaster, I really liked the hawk or the eagle people, where they would open their arms and they would encompass people and then devour them.
The creepy extra. Yeah. So there's the hawk. He's got his like actual Beastmaster hawk thing, but there's these weird alien creature things that are some part of some weird hawk cult with a statue and amulet and stuff.
Yeah.
But they're really Doctor Who-y. I think part of the reason you like them is they're like a Doctor Who creature.
Right.
Because they've got these wings and they entrap people, and they're kind of like some of those plant guys. I can't remember what it was, one of the Scarf Doctor episodes. But it's that kind of level there. Yeah, those guys were super creepy, and it wasn't really, that was also one of those weird things, because the god that was being worshipped by the cult was kind of the same god for the good people and the evil people. It wasn't just evil god, good god. It was the same god, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Cheesy name, not in the Monty Python way. But the temple there where they were sacrificing the children, which really goes back to the Carthaginian thing and some silent movies from the 20s. But anyway, they have that god there where they're sacrificing the children. It's still the normal good people are worshiping that god. He's got the sign on the thing. They've got the cool witches, which, you know, gets into the three witches with the eye, and they have an awesome ring.
With the eye.
The ring where they have eyes, which is fine. Again, you could go into Clash of the Titans with some of this kind of stuff too, which I can't remember what year, but somewhere around the same-ish time. Yeah. Maybe a little bit later. But that was like, there's just so many good things, but it was interesting that way. And another thing about the Sword and Sorcery things, they've got some people that are like super beautiful body buff kind of things that they go, but they also go with people that are more normal looking and still get roles. Like the guy that rescues him is this bald guy that's like totally non-heroic looking dude, but he's like the kick-ass monk guy that goes and kills these witches and stuff and raises them up. And it's like, you know, it's sort of an interesting turn on things. It's not it gets a father figure rescuing the kid instead of.
And there's usually always like a character that I would say is gnarly, like he's scars or his face is all burned, or he's like oh, he's a tough guy. He may not be like the best fighter, but he's a guy maybe who's in the inn that they meet, and he just happens to be like, I like to fuck people up, like, you know what I mean? You're like, yeah, this guy's with us now. Like, there's always that one of those characters that's just really gnarly, like manly man, like, you know, cracks an egg into a bowl of nails and drinks it for breakfast. You're like, okay. But those characters exist, and they're often very entertaining for me to watch as well. Yeah. Just to see that like tough guy type attitude. Like you mentioned, Clash of the Titans. Like, not that it even compares, but the remake has a couple of characters that are pretty gnarly. You know. Yeah. That was a nice adaptation that I liked. You know. Little definition. It's like kind of like when you're playing D&D and you roll really shit and you have to be like no charisma and low intelligence. And you're like, I guess I'm just an asshole that's ugly. Like, yeah, exactly.
So a couple of the trivia things for Beastmaster. It is a hilarious film in many ways, but there were two ferrets in there that were part of Mark Singer's entourage, and. They said so. The trivia is that about 25 ferrets played the role of Kodo and Podo. Now ferrets can't really be trained, so they were often baited with food to go or look where needed. Wow, they must have so many takes to get that stuff, because they did a really good job with it. Yeah, and there were 4 tigers that played Rue in it. The main one, the black tiger. So that was pretty interesting stuff. So. They actually tried to get the director from Conan the Destroyer to direct this film, but the director for Conan the Destroyer actually said that the film script was exceedingly bad, so he didn't want to be part of it.
Really? Oh my goodness.
I don't know. I would say Beastmaster is better than Conan the Destroyer.
I think so.
Conan better, but Beastmaster is a solid pick in the Sword and Sorcery genre.
Yeah. So
there's some sequels. I think they did 3 at least. There's at least a trilogy. I don't know if there's more.
For Beastmaster?
But there's at least 3 in.
So here's a great piece of trivia from Beastmaster. So Mark Singer, who played Dar, he referred to his costume as a leather hula skirt. And apparently when he and John Amos, the monk guy, saw each other on set for the first time in the respective costumes, they each burst out laughing because that's how bad it was. Like, it's horrible.
Again, you're just trying to, this is where these muscle men, you gotta remember from the 60s, 70s, early 80s, the muscle men were coming on. Male physique had changed.
Yeah.
It was a thing to show this.
The bodybuilding. Just bodybuilding as an industry and a sport.
Masculine
really,
body had changed.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's people who've done entire essays and dissertations on the male form and how, but this was a new thing to do this. So it was, they were overcompensating this stuff because it was like, well, what the heck is this?
And as always in Japan, this film was not called The Beastmaster.
Oh.
It was actually called The Miracle Master in Japan. So
weird.
Miracle Master.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Beastmaster. Okay, so we're going to talk about another Sword and Sorcery. Alex, what do you think? What have you seen recently or remember?
I have to say that one of my favorites of all time has to be Willow.
Oh.
And I used to watch that quite a lot as a kid. And I still remember the Hydra that sort of bubbles up out of the around the castle there.
Yeah.
And just sort of swells up in this massive Hydra. It was just such bad CGI. And at the time, I knew it was bad, but it's still
but you still enjoy it.
Me. It was it was such a cool concept. And again, like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, it was much more along the lines of The Hobbit than, say, The Lord of the Rings. And the difference with that, is that we have a character that instead of having a tremendous amount of skill or strength and is able to defeat the opponents directly, you have characters that are cunning, smart, or lucky, and they end up defeating an enemy through a scenario or using a third party or circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So that is much more The Hobbit, i.e. Bilbo Baggins, how he defeated Smaug essentially, or as opposed to Lord of the Rings, which is Aragorn and his level of fighting, or Gimli, all those characters. And again, they do a similar thing with Frodo, right, in Lord of the Rings. But I think The Hobbit just has that sort of same level as Willow, where the character uses the setting or a third party or luck to sort of conquer the day. And it just really has that underdog quality of story. And growing up as a young man, it was just nice. It has hope and strength, even though you may not be in a position where there is hope and strength. Again, something that I draw towards jiu-jitsu, right? You can overcome a scenario with a certain level of knowledge and technique, as opposed to being stronger, faster, smarter. Mm-hmm. And that's really something that I've just applied in many parts of my life. But I think Willow, inherently, that's sort of the main focus of the whole story.
It's your strength of characters, not just we were talking about the body before, but it's really the strength of character.
Yeah, and all the characters are flawed. When you meet Mad Mardigan, who is sort of the stronger male guy, he's a jerk. He's got his problems. Every character has weaknesses and flaws. Again, going back to D&D, when you have those roles, you're not going to be perfect, so you have to embody a certain level of shittiness in different ways, right? And then you have to play through a world as that character. Willow does a great job of having characters that have the same flaws.
So Willow was obviously created and directed by George Lucas, and Val Kilmer was in it. And Val Kilmer actually ad-libbed the majority of his lines for the film.
Really?
Now, according to Warwick Davis, who basically was the main actor, this film was the largest casting call for little people at the time. There's between 225 and 240 actors who were little people, as he calls it, that were hired for the film, which was never done before. Warwick Davis was only 17 years old at the time of the shooting. And George Lucas specifically wrote the film. He wrote the film specifically for Warwick Davis because he met him on the set of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi. He was Wicket.
Yeah.
So he was,
and he reappears throughout many of the films. Correct. He shows up in Star Wars Episode 1. He's in the stands sitting next to the guys who are betting on the pod races.
Yeah.
He shows up throughout them, and he's also in the new ones. Oh man. I can't remember which Star Wars it is. It's going to bug me now. Oh no, it's in the new Han Solo movie. He's part of the Renegade lady. I can't remember her name. Part of the crew for her. So he shows up throughout the entire series. He's just maintained a really good relationship with George Lucas and just the Hollywood cinematic world. Yeah. There is actually a documentary. It was on Netflix. I don't know if it is anymore. I can't remember what it's called. That features his life, and it's really funny. And he plays sort of a satirical version of his life right now.
Oh,
and
I saw that,
yeah, it's really well done. Check it out.
Actually, you were talking about that. I made a mistake because George Lucas actually didn't direct the film. It was Ron Howard who did. And it actually says that Warwick Davis later worked again with Ron Howard on Solo, a Star Wars story. And he plays Wicket in Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi as well. So, I mean, that's kind of where he appears and reappears throughout. So that was a great one. But when I think of Sword and Sorcery, it's a little bit, although Willow does probably fit it, a little bit more, what would you call it, Jason? High adventure? Maybe? Like, because it was a little larger than the hero himself.
Yeah,
yes, yeah.
High fantasy, epic fantasy.
The person of the prophecy was Lord Denon, the baby that he was effectively trying to save. So there was a certain amount of mysticism that was larger than the character, which I kind of understand. It's the same way that Lord of the Rings doesn't exactly fit the Sword and Sorcery, is because you have Sauron and this ancient war and this like massive scale, this very massively larger than the hero themselves level of story. It's sort of how the Greek myths, sometimes you focus on a specific hero, on a specific story, or you focus on how that, like Hercules, for example, right? How he fits into the pantheon of the gods versus him as a hero himself, right? So the same way that, you know, the Greeks used to tell stories and have different multitudes, people have just sort of readapted those levels and talked about them in different ways. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what I would say about that.
And do you remember in the film, there was that wand, that stick wand that Warwick Davis was using in Willow? And so the funny thing about that is apparently that was real wood, but it kept breaking. So they eventually had to make it fiberglass because it was, you know, a lot of stuff going on. Right? Yeah. So, Willow, interesting one. I guess my knee-jerk reaction to that, Alex, is not really Sword and Sorcery from what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Although I agree that,
but it is fantasy, so there's a lot of adjacent things to Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah, like it doesn't fit the one we're talking about, where you have the protagonist being a large, strong male role. But all I think they did is point out that they can achieve the same thing despite having a character that,
in a way, it's kind of a reaction to
exactly. It's saying we're gonna do the same thing, but with a different look on what you're presenting, right? And that, I don't know, I found it refreshing. Mm-hmm. It was a fun story.
And so there's another story that I'm going to introduce, and I don't know if you guys have seen this film. So this is one of my favorite films, actually, and it's called Legend. And it had Tom Cruise in it. It had Tim Curry, and Tim Curry plays Darkness, basically this devil with large red horns. And it's about the last unicorn. And Darkness wants to kill the last unicorn, so Darkness encompasses the world forever, and that he can reign, type of thing. So is this a Sword and Sorcery? It has goblins in it. It has magic. It has fighting scenes, but it's not your typical, I don't know, like loincloth kind of thing. It doesn't have that. But it has all the elements of what Alex was talking about in the very beginning of the podcast. So I would say that Legend, like Willow, is kind of in there as a Sword and Sorcery thing.
Yeah, and again, too, I think also part of the Sword and Sorcery is the era, the style of filming, and there's a lot of overlap specifically between Willow and Legend in that they're filmed in the same era with the same style, with the same type of technology, with the, you know, the firework type explosions and little like actual dynamite. Like that's real. Like they're actually doing that and then having to roll and film off of that. So it might not be perfect because they haven't spent, you know, X thousand number of hours on a green screen making, you know, the new Avengers movie with all, you know, how flawless all that crazy shit was. Like that took a lot of people a lot of time, and these films didn't even have that as an option, not as a possibility, as a concept, you know. So it's just a lot more honest, and I think that kind of, you know, sets the tone and makes them all sort of fit together.
And most of these Sword and Sorcery films have horrible soundtracks. Conan has an amazing soundtrack. Legend has an amazing soundtrack by Tangerine Dream. Highly suggest that if you can find it, that you get it. The score is amazing. But some of them, it's like, I don't know where they get the music from. It's hilarious. It's obviously the big drums. That's a big one. You know,
a lot of horns too, like old school. I don't even know what they would actually use, but they, obviously they're made with bone or whatever. Those kind of horns. There's a lot of Mongolian throat singing and those kind of things.
Right. Hawk the Slayer goes a different way with it, but you guys haven't seen it. So
okay, why don't you talk about Hawk the Slayer?
No, you guys got to see it. There's no point talking about it. It's one of those great. And a hawk is one of those things. You got to have hawks. You got to be in so many different things. You're Beastmaster. You got to have a hawk on you. Right?
So I admit that I have not seen Hawk the Slayer
because it's super cheesy. I'm
going to watch it tonight after the podcast.
Okay, so I won't give you the details, but the thing is, in order for Sword and Sorcery, you can have. We talked about the Conan one where you have a good movie, Conan the Barbarian, and then you get the movies that are bad, like that whatever Ator or whatever that other one, which is garbage. You get ones that are bad, but you get ones that are so bad that they get to be good. Maybe you have to be stoned or something when watching the first time. I don't know. It was the 80s, but but they're so cheesy. You just layer on double, triple cheese, man, and it's just so cheesy. Like, oh my god, it's like kind of gets funny in its own way. That was one of those ones that's got a soundtrack that will really stick in your head. It's not like any other soundtrack, and it doesn't use the drums and stuff. It's got a flute kind of thing, you're the music guy, so you tell me afterwards. It'll be interesting. It's definitely unique in its way that it does it. And other super cheesy ones that are funny and stuff. Wizards and Warriors was a TV show in the 1980s. Okay, it's like super influential on me. I could do a whole episode on that, so I won't go in. But that's super good if you're more newer and you wanted parodies. Or it was like Crodman Dune if you wanted to get. That was a really cheesy one. You can get into the Xena things and stuff. Like some stuff you gotta have a little bit of fun with it. If you take things too seriously, there's serious ones.
So it's maybe going off on a small tangent, but it's a pretty nerdy tangent. But one thing I want to liken to that is it's pretty much how the difference between DC cinema versus Marvel cinema.
Yes.
So DC cinema is like very serious.
Yeah.
It's like so bad that it's just bad. Not to say that the Marvel is bad by any means, but in terms of that superhero, that where they make fun, they keep it light. Through every one of their movies, there's always some kind of comedy. There's a little bit of thing.
Yes. And again, even if you go to Conan, you got to punch out the.
And even when you look at the bad Marvel movies, like the difference between Thor 2 versus Thor Ragnarok, oh my goodness, you loosen up a little bit, and it becomes way better. So much better. Yeah. You almost poke fun at the point of things. You have a couple of those wall breaks to engage the person. Like you think about reading a good comic, it's the exact same thing, right? You can stick to the same boring formula, and you're like, oh, okay, this is the same thing I've read. It's kind of boring. It's blah. You loosen it up a little bit, you can have a lot more fun, and that's where it's like, yeah, it's bad, but it's creatively bad and therefore good.
Yeah.
Right?
So since there are so many films in this genre, I'm going to just run down some that have been around for a long time that I've seen most of these. So you obviously had Conan. You had Conan the Barbarian. You had Conan the Destroyer. You had a little thing called Red Sonja, which was horrible.
It's kind of like you've got Conan, then you've got Conan the Destroyer, then you've got Red Sonja, which is unfortunate because Red Sonja comics just awesome. And Red Sonja, by the way, Robert E. Howard's Red Sonja is very different than how they did it.
Yeah.
The Red Sonja people think of is from the Marvel comics, which was a sort of different creation, and she's got novels and stuff. Really awesome character, but the movie does not do Red Sonja justice. Red Sonja is awesome.
Yeah, so the film really does suck. We did talk about Beastmaster, great.
But we're missing one of the...
Well, there's several. So we're working our way down the list. But, I mean, there's one called Fire and Ice. There's one called Kull the Conqueror. There's one called KRULL, not to be mistaken for Kull. And this is going to be a sticking point for 2 minutes. If you have not seen KRULL, Jason will say, don't.
Well, it's funny because I was asking because I was doing a little research and I wasn't quite sure what the genre was. So when I saw that, I was like, wait, this doesn't fit the bill at all. Like, it's space shit. Like what? Yep. Like I have no concept of what it is. So maybe there's people out there like, what would a brief synopsis be?
That's not the thing. Is because you got to remember before in the early part, science fiction and fantasy were not separate the way that they are. There was weird fiction which blended things together more holistically than modern things. Science fiction and fantasy have become much more separate. But earlier in fiction they weren't. It doesn't necessarily, having technology doesn't necessarily make
Right.
things
No,
symbolic.
and I get what you mean, that it was at that point, that level of technology was so fantasy that that it was different. But I just mean that to me it didn't fit what I typically would have ever imagined or pictured.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Because it's almost like Star Wars in the same way that it becomes a little bit beyond, sword and sorcery when you're talking about lightsabers and the Force, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing, but the concept has changed so much that it's difficult to see the similarities, right?
And so I think the reason that Jason and I hate KRULL so much is everything. And
it had a cool concept, but it doesn't. It's not a fucking glaive.
So there's a weapon in KRULL if you haven't seen it, and it's like this. I think a 5-pronged bladed weapon that you throw, and it's acts like a boomerang, and then it will come back.
It's like the Predators thing.
And back in the 80s, it was cool. You had Discs of Tron. Things were cool, throwing things and stuff.
Yeah, it's horrible.
So Beastmaster has a better throwing thing.
Yeah. Okay, so that's KRULL. We'll never mention it again.
In the infamous words of Stan Lee.
Which one? Yeah, Enough said.
I use this all the time.
Okay, so that's KRULL. But now we're going to get to a film that Jason and I have seen. I don't know if we're thinking about the same one, but
I hope we are.
I'm going to mention The Sword and the Sorcerer.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
But you can't do Sword and Sorcery without doing The Sword and Sorcerer. I don't know how many times I've seen that movie. Probably the fantasy movies, I've probably seen that one.
Yeah, I watched it for the first time today.
Oh, okay, great. So we're all going to be talking about this. So before we start, I have to say that, again, this film was made in 1982. So we have...
Is it 82? Wow. Great year for...
There's something that happens...
That's like our 89 for action.
88.
88 was our action thing.
Yeah,
so
88
action.
is our 88 action, 82 fantasy.
All right.
So The Sword and the Sorcerer came out. Fantasy film, obviously Sword and Sorcery. And... where do we start with this? Here's a piece of trivia that I absolutely love. The demon in it is played by an actor by the name of Richard Mull, and he played Bull on Night Court.
Really? That's the same guy?
Same guy. So,
fuck.
Yeah.
Amazing villain. Now, that's a part of the thing. If you're going to have a good Sword and Sorcery thing, it helps to have a good villain. And Thulsa Doom with Conan, really good.
Yes.
The Sorcerer and the Sword and the Sorcerer, really good villain.
So let's just talk about this film. It was $4 million to make in 1982. It raked in $39 million at the box office. So it was considered a success in 1982. Wow. Pretty amazing. So Alex, you've got two Gen Xers sitting here, obviously, with Jason and I. You are from the millennial genre.
Yeah.
What did you think of Sword and Sorcerer since you watched it today?
I thought it was pretty incredible. It's a good, fun movie. Obviously, the special effects are, again, I think well done because of the technology that you're using, and you have to take other things into consideration. When you're using live explosions or flames or things like this, you can't, take the best part of the fire and put it near that person's face and have the whole scene work out. Sometimes the explosion might be a little too close, the person might not be in the right thing, and you can kind of, again, the fight scenes, if they're massive battle scenes, there's some dudes that are just kind of standing there. There's a lot of weird stuff going on. They didn't have the same level of attention to detail.
Even just the beginning of Sorcerer's Tomb, look at the special effects. They're good use of your money right there. That takes so much atmosphere.
But again, they have a lot of really fun things that they do using the lame technology to make really cool weapons, for example. So
the three-bladed sword.
The three-bladed sword. And just we touched on that, but the detail of it is it's actually a three-bladed sword that you can launch the outer blades out as projectiles while you're fighting. And that's a pretty hilarious thing because that is not practical, and
how unruly would that be?
Ridiculous.
It's there's a Russian.
It's gonna
it does that, but it's just on super steroids.
Yeah, it's not really.
But that's the thing; is you're just gonna cheese it up and take it up. Sword and Sorcerer is a light, fun romp.
And then the other weapon that I want to talk about, which is from, I believe they're called the Red Dragons. Is that right?
The Red Dragon Archers.
The Red Dragon Archers. They have these crazy bows that have built-in little dragon heads that light the arrow on fire, but they don't just have a little lighter or something in there. It's they explode, and they're all standing in a row, and it's just poof, poof, poof. and there's these massive explosions just to light this little fucking arrow. And it's like, why are we even doing this? It's just ridiculous. It's a very cinematic thing using that, in my opinion, just because of where the technology is now. It seems very silly, but at the time they were being innovative and creative with the effects that they had.
Yeah.
Right. And to me, I can appreciate that and think that that's cool, without just being like, oh yeah, that's so stupid. But that's what kind of provoked me to look at it.
It's funny that you look at the technology aspect. I mean, that's not, you've mentioned that in a few of these films, because I mean, you are a product of great CGI and things like that. And your eye is drawn to things like that. I just find it interesting.
Totally. And it changes when I'm watching a film. Like when you guys talk about the thing still being scary, like it was the special effects that were laughable. Like, and not that they were bad, but just for me, it's like, that doesn't look real. It looks like a pile of goo or something.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? And that distracts from the experience when you're talking about fear or being enthralled in a world, because you dissociate, because you're like, that's not real. And my brain is like, immediately recognizes that this is fake.
Because you've seen stuff that's so much better. We're like, oh my God, that's like super hyper realistic. How did you do something so realistic?
Like when I watched The Matrix, it was like incredible. Like that was so real. That was so cool. When you watch The Matrix now, you're like, that's some fake shit. Like the way the bullets traveling and like the sound waves and stuff. You're like, it looks so cool at the time. You're like, oh, I can totally see that. But now it doesn't look as real. And that's just a very brief thing. But like obviously going from a technology that I've never seen before, right? Like, and they don't even do that.
So 20 years from now, when you do a tribute thing to us,
you'll still be alive, I hope.
And then you can go with someone who's 20 years younger, and you can get them to look at The Matrix, and they'll tell you what they think of The Matrix, and you'll have your memories of when you first saw it.
It's always
really interesting. That's it. But this is what's really cool is to see this thing. But I thought Sword and Sorcerer, it was like so good. The coffin, the tomb sarcophagus thing with the faces on it and the blood, the witch ripping the heart out of the chest with the glowing fingers.
Very cool.
The ET fingers. That's what I thought about that. Was like, it's like an ET, but like all of them. Like, oh God.
All of me, even if I'm going home in a different way.
Yeah. So the Sword and the Sorcerer, obviously, like I said, it made $39 million at the box office. It was actually the most profitable independent film of 1982. What? And it even spawned a short-lived production line for 3-bladed plastic swords that resembled talons. Oh, I would have loved to have got my hands on that. And so Variety magazine at the time gave, obviously, the film negative reviews, citing that it was a lackluster script with non-too talented performers, that it's fast-paced atrocity, a-minute action scenes, as they called it.
The pacing is great. There's things happening. It moves the story along. It doesn't have a bunch of,
Well, and that's where
making a volume 1 of Lord of the Rings. You're like, oh my God, we threw the fucking field jet. It's like, no shit.
But it's funny.
The field. But there was a butterfly. A very
fucking stupid singing.
But you have these reviewers who are reviewing these films. Like Roger Ebert at the time says the film that it doesn't care much about character. Like, hello, do you know what you're watching? Like, you shouldn't have these people reviewing films. And despite the negative criticism of the film, it's since gone on to be a cult classic. And Jason and I talk about it at length. And it's when you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it's actually reported at about 71% for critics. Yeah, which is pretty high. That's based on 7 reviews, but the average rating is 5.8 out of 10. So quite a hilarious film, but one that you must watch because it is bad. And some of the fighting scenes, as Alex has pointed out, are really bad. And this sword, it's got 3 blades on it. Can you imagine how heavy that actually would be? Let's say it's like 20 pounds. A 20-pound sword is
4 blades. But
also, when you're like slicing through somebody.
Oh, because of the handle. Yes, there was a dagger in the handle. Yeah. Jason, yes, he nerded out. He out-nerded me. It's true. Yes. So, crazy. Hey, I'm wondering that if any of the listening audience ever had the KRULL sword, that would be wicked. I'd love to get a picture of someone who had it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Sword and the Sorcerer. Please check it out. 1982.
Don't see the sequel.
Never watched the sequel. So there's that. So what other kind of films can we remember from that?
Dragon Slayer.
Dragon Slayer, another great one.
That's another one that's good. That's
really actually
worth watching. And it does an interesting thing. Instead of having, like, you've got the warrior guy against the sorcerer, this is different because it takes a wizard apprentice and then makes him into the warrior that fights the dragon.
Yeah.
Right.
But still is a wizard apprentice at the same time. It's kind of an interesting twist on things. And then you've got lots of little twists in that one. You've got the things where like, oh my God, there's a princess that the dragon's gonna do. They're gonna save her. It's like, no, just
Nope.
gone.
Yeah.
Second princess. Oh my God, she's in the thing they're gonna save. It's like, no. Little dragons, no, gone. Ator. It's like, tropes like sometimes when you twist things to the audience expectations,
yeah.
Little things like that.
And that's what I mean, where it's like, that's where they almost poke fun at what they are, right? To, engage the fact that your brain realizes it's not real, but it's still an enjoyable experience because it's funny or whatever, right?
So
uses a spear instead of a sword.
Yeah.
The blacksmith thing in there again.
Okay, we have to talk about blacksmithing because
that's what I'm saying. Is it's there. It's a big part. The brittle steel, the blacksmith. It's there.
So since this episode is about Dane and it's dedicated to him, and Dane was a blacksmith,
Legit.
There's many of these films that have blacksmithing in them. And let's see. So Conan has one. It's the forging of the
Ator, the Ator one that we watched. They
Ator?
They had some really interesting blacksmiths that we need to talk
this
about.
Doesn't even sure. Why is this
for sure?
Okay, we have to be because if Dane was here, Dane would
I want to know. Yeah,
he would absolutely harp on about Ator and how amazing it is. So we watched a scene in Ator, the Fighting Eagle, and I implore you. I believe it's on Amazon. So watch it. And there's a sequel to which I haven't even watched, but I am going to watch it. So we watched about 5 minutes of it.
But it's the bad, not the so bad.
It was
good.
It's so bad. And it was made in 1982, right? So I think all these films kind of came on the heels of the Conan thing. It's like, oh, well, this is going to be big. So during the scene, our Fighting Eagle, Ator, enters the lair of the bad guy. He's with his blonde female compatriot. Scantily clad, of course.
Very important.
And they're in there, and it's this blacksmithing forge, and it has there's like fire going and smoke, and it's got these guys hitting anvils, the hammers on the anvils and the swords, and they're like tink, tink,
and like fully forging them to like put them in the fire and everything.
And we're watching and like this is weird, and he's walking around them and he's looking at them with his sword, and it's like, why aren't they attacking me? And this is really weird. And then it zooms in. And they're all blind. They all have their eyes that have been taken out, but they're forging swords. And he's hitting it
in like close proximity in a room that has a fucking stairwell that's a big hole with some stairs right in the middle of the fucking room. Like, work safe, wood, shit a brick.
So I know they're blind blacksmithers, and they're making swords. And so we're like, what? And the best thing about this is, so he goes down these steps and he leaves the people blacksmithing, and they're in this little dungeon. And while they're in this dungeon, there is a shield which is on the wall, and the shield is glowing, and we don't know where the light is coming from. It's like I joke, it's like
it took 1 second of me seeing that to know what was going to happen.
So they shone some light on it, and that was like their whole budget. Anyway, what happened is Ator is standing there, and then all of a sudden, the backdrop is the shadow, and the shadow has a sword and is attacking him, and he's blocking the sword strikes, and it's making.
Why do shadow boxing when you can do shadow
sword play? It's
okay, that was a cool concept.
I'll give it. It was so
implementation not so good, but the concept is okay. So move over Play-Doh.
So he is right. He is fighting. He's fighting the shadow sword guy, and losing, and his female compatriot. She kind of goes like this.
Who happens to have been standing for a couple minutes just right by this mirror with this cloak. And as soon as I saw her standing there with the cloak and the mirror, I'm like,
yeah. So she's looking at the thing. She's like, oh, it's casting a shadow. And she keeps looking at it. And Jason's like, cover up the fucking shield. So she goes like this, literally in the film. She grabs this like cloak, and then you can see her face go, ooh. And she puts it over, and then the shadow monster.
Why did they give her any clothes? That the cloak was there for a reason, right?
So good. And that's not even the worst part of this whole scene. So they leave. He's got the shield. They go back upstairs, and all of a sudden, all the blind blacksmithers start attacking them.
They smell him. All of a sudden now,
and it's not in a cool Clash of the Titans way again. Get back to Clash of the Titans.
yeah, so they're fighting him in there, and they're doing actually really well for being blind.
Yep.
And he's using a sword, and he's using a shield, which has the cloak cloth over it still.
Which can't be cut by swords, apparently.
Yeah.
It is so remarkably bad.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, and this is also the one that you can blatantly see all the scenes between him and his female compatriot. They're like literally talking face to face, and she is full on speaking Italian, and they are just fully dubbing over it.
Yeah,
and
it's
he's
like speaking English.
And it's like it's so
70s kung
your
fu
brain is
dubbing.
like, wait, am I having a stroke right now when she's talking, but I can understand him? Like, what the fuck is happening? It's like
so good.
the words match, and then they don't. Like, that's the biggest mind fuck in the whole thing.
Yeah.
Spaghetti sorcerer.
And the other thing is, if you look at the hero Ator, I don't even know the actor's name. He's, obviously.
Yeah, but he's like hair metal guy, right?
But hair metal, like when you look at Beastmaster, the guy's hair was kind of like this. It was long, but like Ator was like poison,
Yes.
or rat.
Yes.
It was like
why didn't they
flowing.
give Thor a Sword and Sorcery movie? That I would still pay money, not the old Thor, but when he was in his prime in the 80s.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The
Heavy metal Thor.
The heavy metal Thor.
Yeah.
He tried to.
Yeah, and like I know that's what I'm saying, but if you would have gotten an actual movie, it would have been so bad it would be good.
Yeah.
Like
that'd
look
be
at
good
some of the
Sword and
music
Sorcery.
videos and stuff. Anyway.
Yeah.
So good. So we implore you to watch Ator the Fighting Eagle to see how remarkably bad
Watch
it is.
watch Sword and Sorcerer, Beastmaster, Dragon Slayer, Hawk the Slayer,
Yeah.
Lady Hawk. There's a lot of hawks. Lady Hawk,
great.
Lady Hawk, again with Beastmaster, you got the same kind of thing. Now there's a great thing where you've got the animal changey thing, and but it's got a nice dual. I don't want to wreck it for you, but it's got like a dual animal changey thing, and actually more of a plot and story going on.
Yeah, I liked Lady Hawk was good. How about, we had talked about this, does Excalibur fall into this as a sword and sorcery?
Excalibur, I think in a lot of ways it does, and it's done a good job. I'll mention before I forget is that before we do a lot of Star Wars here, so before Star Wars, before the movie, they had a little short. I'll edit out my other rant, but before movies, they used to show little things. So there was a little short movie called, I think it was called Black Angels, about like half an hour, 25 minutes, something like that. Little short fantasy movie that was shown before Star Wars, but it was really influential. If you watch it, you can see how Excalibur in a lot of ways is kind of based off. But Excalibur is another one of those really good ones, and a lot of the same. I bet some of the props from Excalibur are the same things that were used in Sword and the Sorcerer. Look at some of the armor and weapons and things that are in there. It's got the same sort of aesthetic for some of the things.
And we've already discovered doing this podcast that many of these films are reusing props from Hollywood. And one that comes to mind that we've already done was the movie by John Carpenter, which was They Live. And they had this little device, and the actual device that they were using was from Ghostbusters, and it was a PK meter. It was this exact same. Yeah. And we looked it up, and we took still photos of it, and it's the exact same thing. So fantastic that they are reusing stuff.
Excalibur, really good.
Excalibur, amazing. And I have to, Alex already pointed this out, but he had said, he goes, in Ator, we're watching, it's like, look at the armor. And they had like armor from like 9 different periods in history. Like there was samurai armor, and then full plate mail, and then Ator doesn't have anything. He's got like yak
It's always Mongolian style type things.
Whatever's laying around in the
so horrible.
So in the same way that Excalibur is, even though it has religious like overtones, which is also a really interesting thing, because a lot of these things are actually very similar. Like Sword and Sorcery are essentially just like fan fiction myths, right? So in the same way that the movie that I want to talk about is Jason and the Argonauts. I don't know if you saw that. Same time that Clash of the Titans came out. Very similar.
The new Clash of the Titans, or the
old one.
You can go back further. You could do like the Sinbad one. So
yeah,
it's like awesome. So stop action,
claymation.
Yep. Yep. And again, where it's just the retelling of these ancient stories and myths, which centralize around this world that's so much beyond what people are. And a big part of this is that at that time, the wilderness existed. If you left home, if you leave the village, the safety of society, you could be victim to the wild, to the supernatural, to whatever it is. So in their myths, in their myths and their storytelling, it's centralized around this much more sort of horrific, it jumps up a level where you think you have a handle on reality, and then it goes like Alice in Wonderland. You just tumble down the fucking rabbit hole and you're in somewhere very scary where you could die. And that's sort of the moral of these stories and these myths. But people sort of misinterpret the whole fairy tale aspect and decide that this is truth and this is reality. And that sort of shapes these myths and these stories, is that they're so detailed, like in Lord of the Rings, where you dive in and he creates this whole world, this whole fantasy. You could just get lost in the architecture and the landscape that has come about because of the Tolkien like series. You can go Star Wars, you can fucking become like an engineer in like Death Star shit. Like, it's crazy what exists out there because of this sci-fi fantasy stuff. So, you know, I think that it's really cool to see how myths and storytelling shape a society. And I think it shapes people. And you can tell, like, all three of us around here, we like these kind of stories and we like this kind of creativity. And we all like it for different reasons slightly. But it's something that sort of shapes who we are as people, just like
sticks with you.
The primary storytellers would shape their reality, right?
Yeah. It is modern myth for us. Yeah.
And we encourage you to watch these films because they are fun. I mean, that's really it when it comes down to it. I know a lot of people is like, well, the special effects suck and the storyline sucks. And like, we know, like, just because you're
super sexist.
Yeah, but again, look at back to our Star Trek, some of our earlier shows, Star Trek, the original Star Trek. The visual effects suck. What? No, but the show's awesome.
Yeah,
and if you lean into that and you go with it, you make something really good.
The story and the mythology, it doesn't need to be flashed up. It doesn't need to have these amazing effects or be so real that, like, sometimes you have dreams, and if you actually remembered everything about the dream, you'd be like, yeah, no shit, this is a dream. But you're only focused on the right things and it becomes reality, right? Yeah. If you watch an animated series long enough, your brain eventually accepts that's the reality, right? And they've actually done studies on that, right? Yeah. So you actually can accept that reality. And again, that's why for me, looking at some of these stuff, because of the level that it is, it's hard for my brain to be like, oh yeah, this.
But if we sat you down with a marathon, if we had you captive for a week, and we did a first choice Super Channel marathon like in the 80s, remember? Right? Super Channel.
This is what we're gonna do now.
Like, then you'd watch a whole bunch of these all together. You'd be like right in the zone, like the kind of stuff where you would sit there, and this is what you do. You'd sit there for 6 hours watching back to back things.
And when you did that, and you ended up playing Dungeons and Dragons, you would immediately have all these ideas, and you would go and you start, if you're DM, you would create these worlds because you were being influenced by these movies, and it would just expand your mind. Like, how many times did that happen, Jason? Like a ton, right?
I was just working on Red Dragon Archers earlier.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And again, you can pull influences and combine things, right? Like a lot of these stories, they all build off of each other. Like in Game of Thrones, there's certain characters that are, adapted to this person or that person, right? And in the same way that Star Wars and where Lucas drew his inspirations from, right? All these stories.
And they draw their inspirations. Now, interesting, same with that. Game of Thrones, that one of the things that he's particularly proud of is how he made the dragon in the Game of Thrones, and he did it with the non-arm dragon, the wing arms instead of the arms.
Yeah.
And Dragon Slayer had the right kind of dragon that he based his dragons in Game of Thrones off the Dragon Slayer. If I'm not mistaken, I could be mistaken. So
totally.
super fans come get me. But
even when you go to something like we had another episode where we talked about zombies and we talked about the Lich. If you look at somebody like Voldemort, who is an incredibly pop culture fucking Lich, like to a T.
But you wouldn't
get that without the earlier... into a phylactery, and they call it a Horcrux. It's like she didn't invent something. That's literally the exact same thing.
It's using it, and that's the thing. Is all these old cheesy movies from the 80s are based on comics from the 70s,
and they
are based on the Pulp Fiction things from earlier. There's a continuity of thought that goes through these things, even if people don't consider them serious literature, but they still have just as much of a pedigree as serious stuff does.
So I guess Sword and Sorcery is its own. I mean, it's its own genre and subculture of geekdom. I mean, not everyone's into it, but we are, because it's Sword and Sorcery, and it's fun. And I know that if Dane was here, he would have gone on about so many aspects of these films. I would love to have heard his opinion on the blacksmithing and how hilarious it is. I can actually hear him laughing if he was watching Ator with us and what was going on, and I'm sure he would have some awesome one-liners. Again, I want to thank Dane's brother, Yuri. I've been in contact with him. Awesome dude. And obviously Belinda as well, who's sending me his first throwing axe, which is going to be great. It's just going to go right up to next to Odin's Eye up there. So the shield by my friend Polly, which is great. We're going to have a toast. This is going to be for Dane, so stand by. As you can typically see, we have our glasses, but today we're going to be doing our toast with our drinking horns for our Viking buddy, Dane, who is watching from Valhalla, and I'm sure he enjoyed this episode, and we really appreciate you being part of this. So this is for Dane. Dane, as they say, skål!
Skål!
So as we usually say on the Torvus Podcast, thanks for joining us, and keep on geeking on.